2 weeks ago, on June 3rd, our office represented Darrin Smith, a 50-year-old man who was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for selling 6 rocks of cocaine, totaling $110 in value. He was sentenced in 1998. And the reason for this sentence was because he had 3 prior nonviolent drug offenses or convictions, and under Georgia law, he could be sentenced to life because of that. And also, he could be sentenced to serve his entire life sentence without the possibility of parole. So this year marked his 18th year in prison on this LWOP sentence. And after many, many years of Mr. Smith fighting his case on his own, we stepped in and a judge finally resentenced him to time served. And Mr. Smith is now home. We walked into the hearing with a lot of support. Despite Mr. Smith having been in prison for 18 years, he had substantial family support and community support. His parents, 4 of his sisters, a niece who was a baby when he went into prison and who is now a high school graduate, a brother-in-law, and a pastor came to his hearing, as did his trial lawyer, who represented him at the time of trial, and to this day says that this is one of the most memorable cases that he's ever handled, and he believes that Mr. Smith was the only one of his clients serving LWOP, which was just devastating on a number of fronts given the crime that Mr. Smith was convicted of. So there was all this support in the courtroom, and there was just a sense of urgency because this felt like Mr. Smith's one and only chance to be heard by this judge on this issue. As I mentioned before, Mr. Smith has been writing all sorts of motions to the court over the years, just pleading with the court to hear his case, and not once had he been brought back to court. So this was the first time that he had been brought back to court since he was convicted 18 years ago. And we basically laid out to the court why Mr. Smith's sentence was cruel and unusual. And our most powerful evidence, I think, was the fact that Mr. Smith, aside from serving an LWOP sentence for selling 6 rocks of cocaine, totaling $110 in value, he was one of 7 co-defendants in this case. All the other defendants in this case were also charged with selling and or possessing cocaine. And of all the defendants in this case, Mr. Smith was the only one still in prison. 4 other people in this case have been sentenced to prison time, but none of them served more than 4 years. Some of them served 13 months or a year, but Mr. Smith, up until 2 weeks ago, had served 4 times more than anyone else. Another compelling aspect of this case was just how rare Mr. Smith's case was. He was the only person convicted in this county who was in prison serving life without the possibility of parole for drugs. He's the only person in the 3-county judicial circuit where he lived who was serving LWOP for nonviolent drug offenses. And he was one of only 10 or 11 people in the entire state of Georgia who was serving life without the possibility of parole for a nonviolent drug offense that didn't involve trafficking. So all of these things combined to make a showing that Mr. Smith's sentence was incredibly disproportionate to the offense that he committed and just cruel and unusual beyond measure. And thankfully the judge agreed. He said that he remembered this case. He was a young judge when this case was heard, and because there were so many co-defendants in this case, it was one of the longest trials he had ever handled. And so he remembered the case well, and he thought that Mr. Smith had, quote, more than paid his debt to society. And he agreed that Mr. Smith has served much too much time, and agreed to allow Mr. Smith, who is now 50 years old, to go home. It was an emotional moment at that point. All of Mr. Smith's family members were crying, as was Mr. Smith, and it was just one of the most memorable experiences that I've had here at the Southern Center. Among the many missions of the Southern Center is to advance racial justice in our work and to encourage and push forth policies that are smart on crime and really reduce our state's addiction to prisons and incarceration. And Mr. Smith's case just meets all of those things. He, again, is one of only 10 or 11 people serving life without the possibility of parole sentences for nonviolent drug offenses. And every single one of those people who are serving LWOP for drug offenses is Black. They're all Black men. And the notion that we would have people in prison for decades on end, or for the rest of their lives over the most minor drug offenses, just completely offends and shocks the conscience. And it is our duty to not only push for, policy changes, but to really try to bring meaningful change and relief to the people who are daily impacted by these unjust laws. So, we wouldn't be fulfilling our mission if we didn't work with people like Darrin Smith and the many other people who are representing to undo this incredible injustice.